After surveying the crop and reflecting on its startlingly strange behavior, the agricultural psychologist paced about for a bit, shaking his head, then stopped, tapped his pencil on the clipboard, and said to the farmer, "Though I have nothing specific to tell you, I will say this. Even when things have no explanation, they have an explanation." Some artists in several fields were talking, and one of them said, "Have you noticed that when the creative spirit is really on you, and you produce a masterpiece, that you complete the work almost as quickly as you can move, but that it takes forever when what you've done sucks?" To himself, one of the group mused, and how true also regarding the living of one's life. And now for a correction to an ancient philosophical mistranslation. It should read, "The unoriginal life is not worth living." Leastwise for some. In one prison camp, they are able to keep everyone under control without much force by simply assuring each prisoner for the first 40 years of their life that they're not one. A viewer writes, "In the above story, I would personally have preferred that it said in one prison camp they were able to keep everyone under control rather than they are able, if you get what I mean." Oh, I get it, sir. I know exactly what you mean. Just look at it, Herodotus. Don't you just love the past? It's, well, so calm, so peaceful, so downright safe and predictable. I just love it, don't you? All right, you scumbuckets, back in your cells. The instructor said to the class, "Without drugs, there is nothing." And someone asked, "How about thinking?" "Especially that," he briskly responded, only to have the whole class break out in uproarious laughter and him to realize that the joke was on him. Moral: what is quicker than the speed of light? Answer: a too quick response. Moral: shut up and go stand in the cloak closet. From our corrected edition of the Theological Dictionary. Evil: the name given local conditions in three-dimensional worlds by those with only two fuel supplies. And now on to our expanded version of our totally unabridged thesaurus. Stupidity: giving a name to anything around here. A young cosmic scout passing through our area stopped to take mental note that the great thing about harshness is that it is entirely non-selective. And a man fanatically clutching some soggy, outdated wood was laughed at and challenged by the wind. "Let's see you start a fire with that." Have I noted lately that if you can see this, when they're all on one page, like 3 or 4 items, I get the impression that they were intended in some way to be related. Because I don't know why I bother with that, because they're all related. Of course, I would be shaking weeks and months' worth together if I could do that physically. There was once a man who struggled mightily for the Enlightenment, and as he learned more, he began to write about it, and soon produced a volume of 10,000 pages. But as he pressed on and understood more, he began to edit. And soon the work was down to 1,000 pages, then 100, then 10, then even less. There have always been men struggling mightily for the awakening who do learn something along the way. After their signing of the unusual peace treaty, one of the opposing parties looked at it and in a tone of some astonishment said to the other, "Quite an accommodation." And a bystander mused, "But pales in comparison to that between man's body and mind." By its own definition, What can actually be said about originality that itself is not unoriginal and plagiarized? The first man to step away from the crowd turned to them and declared, "We are victim of what we are," only to be joined by a second who proclaimed, "Nay, we're a victim of what we've done," which was immediately countered by a third who said, "No, we're a victim of what we think." Then there was a pause of considerable length. Considerable. Until yet another man stepped out to say, "We're a victim of what we are." Now, I've got a question for you. How many amongst the crowd, which constitutes all of humanity, do you think realized that by the last man's notion, they were right back where they started? One day, the king announced, "No one may marry my daughter who is not as dense as me." And thus, man's routine line of mental succession is preserved. Someone asked a mystic, "What do you want to come back as in your next life?" And the more perceptive one thought, "Why do not men ask themselves what they wanted to be in this one and then forgot about?" And a man wrote to the advice doctor, "Dear doctor, I'll tell you exactly why mystics aren't more popular than they are. It's because of those very kinds of things that last guy just thought about." Just what's their problem anyway, doc? One day the village smithy declared, "No one may marry my daughter who will not sit on me and her both." And a passing band of wandering neurons quickly took in the scene and decided not to get involved. A creature visiting Earth was told after a few days, "If you think religion's a bunch of gobbledygook, why don't you get a load of psychology?" And the visitor slapped his forehead in mock horror. Well, I think it was mock. Sarcasm. Humor, with what little humor there is in humor, removed. Backstage, two guys were talking, and one asked the other, "What's the one undeniable benefit of being a comedian?" And when the other one couldn't answer, he did. "It's that no one can make fun of you and make you feel bad." The other guy pondered for a moment, then said, What about if you tell him that as a comedian he stinks?" And the first guy then pondered this for a moment, then said, "Well, why in the hell would you want to say such a nasty thing to someone as fine and decent as a comedian?" And now that feature on our show, previously billed as our moral dilemma of the day. What do? Do you laugh or cry upon hearing that all the attendees to the Intergalactic Critics Convention fell into a cesspool? Well, my, what a perfectly nasty thing for one side of the brain to say to the other. Okay, all you shit drippers, break's over, back in the conference room. Satirical commentary. Insight, with what little insight there is in ordinary insight, removed. And a viewer writes, "The main thing that makes me nervous and uneasy about you is that you often sound like you're attacking and making light of something serious you said earlier. This makes me highly nervous and uneasy. Yours, etc." One of the elder elephants in the herd, who attempted to pass for their shaman and wise man, one day said to a younger one, "With age comes wisdom." And the youngster's consideration of his words was tempered by the reality of the elder's gross overweight condition. Now tonight's double-barreled quiz. What's the difference between a drunk and an alcoholic? You know that one. A drunk doesn't have to attend the meetings. Okay, try this one. What's the difference between a real mystic and a pretend one? Same answer. And that same viewer says, "Hey, don't make me right again." In the effort to awaken to a greater understanding of life, the most useless assistance is certainly the advice of others. And yet, to ever get on the right train, anyone with even a smidgen of intelligence will ask a conductor for directions. And as always, within an enclosed rail system, even metaphorical info both makes sense and doesn't as well. See, since realizing that this is one of the first things that happens in the awakening, is why so many who experience it immediately go, ah, all aboard, from here to infinity, from here to eternity, from here to everywhere, and damn near back again. Kinda. Which also causes one to go, ah. As Adam was leaving the garden on that fateful day, he stopped at the gate, turned to God, and asked, would I have been better off to begin with if I hadn't started thinking? And God kind of snorted, you silly boy. Had you not, we wouldn't be staying here having this fine little chat. Now off with you. A man wrote the myth doctor, dear doctor, what the hell kind of myth you call that? And now, revealed here, tonight, in person, for the very first time in your native language, the reason why every myth you ever heard let you down. Because by the time you heard it, it was no longer original. More ancient truisms brought up to date and straightened finally out, as portrayed in the following conversation. A rich man won't take no for an answer. Hell, a rich man won't take anything for an answer. And as the crowd was leaving, one man asked a companion, you think that was really about wealth, or maybe something to do with how a man's mind gets all filled up? And his friend shrugged his shoulders and suggested that they go get something to eat. Just as some conspiracy theorists believe that the powers that be are actually behind the public demonstrations against themselves, so too should a more alert man realize that the meaningless force thinking of the collective is all that's really responsible for what normally passes for his own individual thinking. I say, Carruthers, who's that outside making all that noise and picketing us? Well, I say, sir, it looks an awfully like you and I. An awful lot. Stick to the script. Oh, I'm sorry. But it was so, well. The teacher asked for students to give a concise descriptive outline of human existence, and the first one called on offered. Born, grow, become religious, die. Then a classmate responded, born, grow, become philosophical, die. The teacher then pointed to little Bruno and he said, born, die. And she said, well, that's a bit brief, don't you think? And he said, yeah, but it's almost time for recess. As they sailed along in their time machine, they played games to pass away the space. Said one to the other, what's the worst thing about the past? And answered the other, its total lack of originality. A man sitting by the rear door was softly singing to himself, oh, I have something that gives me a thrill. It always has, and it always will. And the other passengers weren't sure if he was a sex maniac or a mystic. Reminiscence. Small talk for the deceased. A boy asked his father, why do so many tigers think it criticism if you comment on the color of their stripes? And the old man said, what do you mean by so many? And the lad replied, all? That's more like it, my boy. A passenger staying near the rear door looked away from his newspaper and wondered how, if you find a man not subject to routine influences of his peers, can you be sure if he's more conscious or just over the hill? The intricate, near Machiavellian interconnections of reality are such that only those who know. The head of the secret school told those attendant, The first rule of the mythical warrior is, don't be delicate. And one among them responded, but how about those of us who are delicate? You also. The Mystic's Guide to Guff. As the threat of potential combat was felt again by one man regarding his relationship to those about him, local conditions secretly slipped up beside him, poked him in the ribs, and urged him on, hey, they can't talk about you like that. And sure enough, they could and could not, which continues to be the unrecognized par on those poorly maintained, courses, twin-brained, with mental holes near manicured. 4, you ratty bastards, back in the bunkers for all of you. In reaction to one of our recent medical news stories, a man inquires, if sight will get better if you quit reading, might my thinking improve if I stopped listening? The intricate, near Machiavellian sensory connections are such that none comprehend them save those who do. It's one thing to sing, oh, you can't get away, no, you can't get away, and quite another to live it. That is, as far away from it as is possible in a closed system. Only lions who've picked up joke distorting mirrors have the desire to get away from themselves. After being surprised once again by events, a man looked out his portal and said, well, slap me around and call me Gladys. And life said back, well, I'll slap you around, but I'll call you whatever I want to. It takes mighty common spectacles, hearing aids, and reflecting devices for a man to fall victim to such shoddy con jobs. It's been called the enlightenment, the awakening from sleep, the entry into the kingdom of heaven, yet truth be told, 'tis but neural activity seeking higher ground. A boy asked his father, can the truth ever give you the blues? Can yellow ever be any color other than it is? He replied. And need it now actually be verbalized? Perhaps so. So, today's tip regarding your hearing. If you listen to others, you'll go deaf. And now for today's news regarding advice. A man wrote to the advice doctor, dear doctor, and the doctor interrupted, yeah, I know, go to hell. Some neural agva news. Local conditions said to one guy, look, even if you don't agree, just pretend to go along with it. And the guy replied, sorry, I don't do imitations. Bumper sticker on Mystic's car. Originality, my country. Love it or leave it. Ha ha, just kidding, of course. What it really said was, originality, my country, right or wrong. Ha ha, just kidding. Life told one man, don't quote me on that. And some years later, the man said the same to life. From an ordinary mind's view, I guess that the absolute worst thing you could say about originality is that it is so unpredictable. In exasperation, life finally said to one guy, hey, don't take my word for it. If you insist we're still around the area that I had described as a non-linear process of going from literal thinking, metaphorical thinking, to symbolic thinking, which at a perhaps wider, from a wider vista would be, I could make it into a dual concept, literal thinking and then all allegorical. Albeit that I had a specific finer distinction than is in any wise normally necessary, much less practical, between the metaphorical, that is, of being able to think / speak, but we're more interested in think here, to be able to think in one way to think something and you mean something else, which is a mental variation, mental version of what would be metaphorical thought or metaphorical speech as it's normally said, like poetic speech and etc. But rather than saying one thing, such as some dirty dog some dirty dog backed into my car in the parking lot, which is metaphorical, not very poetic perhaps, but everybody knows that you don't think the dog driving a car backed into your door. You mean something else, and everybody knows it. I don't think we'd ever find the term in any sane tome, any rational, ordinary tome of the term metaphorical thinking. Not that a reasonably educated, sophisticated person would find any fault with it. They go, yeah, but people just, you don't think in that manner. That is, you don't think about metaphorical thinking. Whereas, if there was such a thing as a willful, metaphorical piece of speech or writing, as many people after the fact believe, long after the fact, are you sure Melvin's dead? There doesn't seem to be any doubt about it. Well, in that case, I'm going to write a paper about the metaphorical significance of that goddamn whale and that one-legged guy. But you're sure he's dead? Oh, yeah. Sure. If there was such a thing as instant, contemporaneous, or contemporary metaphorical effort, such as writing, it would indeed require metaphorical thinking. Everyone knows that. And so you could get people to say, yeah, there's such thing as metaphorical thinking. They would not find that to be one of the stranger terms of which I may have come, up with which I may have come. But you do understand, I mean, consider it. It's just know one of these aspects of the difference between trying to do something unusual and not trying to do anything out of the ordinary. Is that metaphorical thinking makes absolute sense, everyday sense, except no one has ever had occasion to even say the term, unless they were misspeaking, unless it was Dr. What's his name, Professor, pardon me, Patton, may I show you to a sheet? Professor Malaprop, I think he was married to the old lady. No one ever would even think of to come up with a term, to even say the term metaphorical thinking. But that is what's involved with, that is what would be the mental aspect of being more conscious, of not being limited to a binary, dual fuel-driven sense of consciousness in a three-dimensional world, three-dimensional reality, is you would have to be thinking metaphorically. That is, what you are thinking is running parallel to the literal thought that is the collective sanity of humanity at any particular time. You've got to be engaged in a running adjustment wherein you're thinking parallel, tracking at another level what is the ordinary thought of the day is, including your own, and not interfering with it, but you're looking at, and it's kind of a running adjustment. It is a sort of translation wherein what you're translating is completely beyond, is different than what the words are saying. That is the thinking. Having cleared that up, once again, then even beyond that would be the symbolic. The symbolic, you mean literally what you say, but you mean something else. Let's try this. I'm sure it won't help a goddamn bit, but hey, we paid money for the board. If we looked at, you remember I was doing the one, if this was if human consciousness was this movie screen up here, ordinary literal thinking would be there you're born down in this row of seats, and there you are watching the screen. That's literal thinking. Well, then I was trying to say, we're not worried about perspective right now, that then there's this balcony that you have to conjure up yourself wherein you begin metaphorical thinking. When you're looking down at this, doing the ordinary thinking, and you're doing your own kind of adjustment, your own kind of translation, but what you're thinking now vis-a-vis that is not what you mean. You understand? Because it's already doing the literal thinking. So if any of this is going to make mathematical, logical sense, then I'm going to in a second say, then symbolic thinking is to metaphorical thinking, as metaphorical thinking is to literal thinking, except it's more than that. Then if there was another, even a higher balcony up there, would be the symbolic thinking. It eats up everything. See, this is tied to the literal thinking. It is your own interpretation. It is you being allegorical. It is you personally engaging in continual parables, not reading somebody else's, not reading the parables of a Jesus or any Old Testament prophet or a Buddha or anybody. The parable, the basis of the parable, the basis of all allegorical thinking, when it's original. After it's not original, who gives a damn except ordinary people? And they're the ones that go, oh, that's very exciting. How old is that? 2,000 years old. Well, that's even more exciting than I thought. Well, wait a minute, if you like that, I got something here that's 3,000 years old. You're kidding me. Let's have it. That's the way that goes. But then if you say, wait a minute, I got one that sounds very similar that some guy wrote last week. I get out of here. 3,000. Let me see that other one. The metaphorical thinking. I was going to tell you about that is the basis of every form of parable, all of the real myths. The real myths. No, I'm sorry. I took a small trip myself, a real myth. Hey, why not? A real myth. What was metaphorical thinking at the time, see? Because when somebody in biblical scripts say that the idea of paradise, that someday the lion will lay down with the lamb. Now, of course, I was pointing out that curious situation again. Now you have biblical scholars, theologians, philosophers, all sorts of people, now taking that allegorical and through their greater understanding, translating it literally, which I was reminded of that one since I threw it in last time. If you remember that I pointed out that was a kind of, it was headed, I think, as proverbial pictures straightened out, brought up to date. And it said that if the lion and lamb ever do lie down together, the whole jungle will shortly starve. See, because literally what that represents to ordinary minds is, or they even translate it, I don't have to do it for them, is that's the idea of paradise. That's the idea, either paradise, utopia on earth, or afterwards, wherein there is no longer any conflict. That someone, as two creatures as mortally opposed to one another, such deadly enemies, at least from one view, from one side, as a lion and a lamb, is ordinary men, good thinking, decent men and women, just sort of get little trembles and their jockey shorts want to roll up and down when they hear the idea about, and the day shall come when the lion and the lamb will lay down together. Well, it does. It has a nice, because you think, well, what that means is the day will come that there's not shootings, muggings in my neighborhood, and that people won't be killing each other. It is actually based originally, literally, and then somebody turned it into a symbol, and now people want to turn it back into a literal. What the dream is, what made that happen was the energy running through the human nervous system having a sense of tomorrow, the future. It was dreaming of a kind of unusual cooperation between one's hormones and neurons. Because the lion and the lamb's not going to lay down together. They're not enemies. There's no problem going on. Because the point was, if they actually did, which is the dream of literal-minded people, they will say so. It is the dream, the whole idea. All religions that believe in an afterlife. Is anything like a real myth? All religion is they say the same thing. Die, go to the Elysian fields, go to Mount Olympus, to heaven, to paradise. No sickness. Of course, you'll never die, which covers that. But plus, you'll never get mugged. Nobody will be around hounding you for money, for handouts, and getting spare change. It's mainly aggression. That lions and lambs, you'll look out and no bloodshed. Not only are you safe, that you're not going to be mugged by some rogue angel, but you look out there and there's no hostility. They're an innocent little lamb, which represents all right thinking people. Everybody thinks of themselves as a little lamb, especially if they're not feeling well and faced with death. And here's this lion. There's always somebody greedy. If it's not death, it's a banker, an attorney, an accountant, the IRS, the government. That a poor little helpless lamb, the day will come that a lion comes up, and instead of eating it goes, come here, you. Give him a little noogie on the head. They lay down. It is probably the best known, it's thousands of years old picture of a kind of paradise. But do understand, what is it representing? What makes ordinary people originally attracted to it? Forget whoever said it first, but it is now part of the collective wisdom, which makes it no longer of any, it renders it jejune. It is no longer of any, has any nourishment to a real would-be thinker. Other than if you know how to use history and turn it inside out, and then when you can do that, you can repeel a grape. You can eat it from the inside out, but that's another story. Thank God. Oh, you didn't want me to get into that. The story represents what would be the perfect cooperation, a perfect balance, but cooperation, if you'll follow this, between hormones and neurons, or from the more simple description, between man's body and his mind. The belief that there is the sensation, based upon reality, that there is a kind of conflict. For those of you that didn't particularly like about when they signed, these warring parties signed that highly unusual peace treaty. And one of them, as he looked at it, what they'd done, and he looked up at the other guy, the other force, the other party, and says, "Quite an accommodation." And they both nodded. And a bystander mused, "But pales in comparison to that extant between a man's body and his mind." You understand what accommodation means in political/militaristic? An accommodation. Like it's a peace treaty, and nobody actually surrendered. One side didn't give in, which neither side with any sane person gives in this apparent, quote, struggle between a man's body and his mind. The neurons and the hormones, as I like to say, because it sounds less specific and tends to make one be less immediately sure what I'm talking about. I didn't know that was a problem. Watch it. It tends to encourage one to think allegorically on your own. Because if you figure there's any purpose to all of this, believe it or not, and if you figure that I specifically know what I'm talking about, even when I drop the script, instead of saying body and mind, hormones and neurons. Because for one, if nothing else, it's to encourage you on your own to even think, well, why don't you just say body and mind? Everybody says that. Exactly. And your mind could even say, well, if you just say body and mind every time you start all this crap about neurons and hormones, I have to remember what it is. If you just say body and mind, we could press on because I'd know immediately what you meant. I know. See, now I'm playing the part, hopefully, of someone a bit more alert, and you go, oh, see? That's why I do not translate ancient metaphysical text for you. I write them on the spot. Very ancient. Well, hell, some of these things are, well, by now, well, all right, look, some of these already by now are damn close to 25 minutes old. It was a dream, back to the lions and lambs, of what would be a kind of accommodation, a final accommodation. Well, that would actually represent a real peace treaty. Quite an accommodation between a man's body and his mind, and everything that represents to the ordinary thinking, between a man's carnal spirit and his higher aspirations, between a man's civilized urges and those which unconsciously or some way, from ordinary views, that in some way are yet still feral, sort of uncontrollable and dangerous. And so the idea of a lion and a lamb laying down together would be the as yet unreached accommodation between the kind of crude physical, sensory, hormonal, sexual, greedy urges, territorial urges that men still have. Oh, I know, except educated, sophisticated people. And I know they don't because they say they don't. And hey, a man should always respect his betters. They say they don't, so we'll exclude them. That was a little joke. Except for you decent, ordinary people who might be tuned in. And of course that was not funny whatsoever. Not a joke. It is the dream of an accommodation between hormones and neurons that has yet to be reached. Not to insinuate it ever will be. But it is a dream that in some way there would not be this kind of conflict of me wanting to be uncivilized, of here I'm all dressed up and yet I won't go out. I'm just making the crude examples. They're all meaningless to someone more alert because they're all based on behavioral aspects of life. But the ideas that many people have, the origins of all guilt at the ordinary behavioral level of men thinking, well, they're saying, they're all dressed up and they're decent people, judges, politicians, leaders of countries. Then it turns out that in their spare time at night after work, they dress up in women's clothes and get drunk and beat up little Boy Scouts and try to take them into steam rooms and God knows what all. I don't even want to think about it. Just horrible things. And it's their dream is I wouldn't have to put up with this. I wouldn't feel guilty. I could be an actual, fill it in blank, civilized person, humane person. I could be a saint. I could be a philosopher. I could be a real Buddhist, real Jew, real Muslim, whatever. If there was that kind of working accommodation wherein in me a lion and a lamb, well, according to how gross, according to how wide awake you are, is between here and here, somewhere down, that would be the lion and the lamb laying down together. Now they're living together in the same forest, in the same area, but the idea that they'll lay down and there won't be all this conflict, that'd be quiet and accommodation. Metaphorical thinking, I was just using that example, it was the basis of that original because there is no such thing as that literally happening. It's only crude, simple minds that will believe that will happen. And even they're not something crude enough to believe it will happen now. That's why it has to be put forward in paradise some other time. Like, well, it will happen. Maybe. But not in spatial, temporal terms as they believe it. Work on that one. That is some future life. Some future. But there's no future life. There's this life and there's the future of this life. And this is always the nervous system of man, being a subdivision of life, dreams of the future. It ends up being translated because of overeating at night, and the future seems to be too unpredictable, too unstable, and so the dreams of the future, you're going to hate me for doing this because I'm not going to follow it up, but the dreams of the future end up being translated by the ordinary human mind as dreams of the past. That's why all myths you ever heard don't work. I've already been through that one. That's because by the time you hear them, they're already passé. They're out of date. They're non-original. Those of you getting real good, of course, can take a peek at this, that there is no such thing as decent mythical information. Even from the best source going, well, let's just make an example, just for an example. How about me? By the time I say it, it's not as good as you'd have thought it. It's still partially out of date. If you can get it from one voice, the speed of sound, you can go, that's pretty fresh. It is. But it still pales compared to the freshness of being able to do it yourself. It was original metaphorical thinking that saw such, that was the genesis of such ideas as pictures of lions laying down with lambs, and rich man cannot get into the kingdom of heaven, cannot reach a higher state of consciousness. It would be easier for a tenor to get through the eye of a needle in full costume after a full Italian meal. Metaphorical thinking, back to where we were. Literal thinking, everyone does. Everyone does literal thinking. That is the basis of many of the translations and new versions I've given you to the Judaic Christian version of creation in the Garden of Eden, all the little stories I've made up, the versions over the last 6 or 8 months. And tonight I even point out that he was leaving on that day. Even Adam turned back to God. And he went, would I have been better off to start with if I hadn't even began thinking? Okay. Some of them seem worth backing up and taking one more shot. Everyone starts out and everyone thinks literally. You can live easily. You can live with no effort, to say the least, for your appointed days and do nothing but think literally. I say that, and even that's not literally true. It would be intellectually speaking. Now, if you did not have an intellect, which does not apply, but if you were actually just a humanoid sans intellect, none of this would apply. But there is no such thing as that any longer. So everyone thinks, and you can think solely at the literal level. But as I started to say, that is not totally correct, because there would be no nourishment. There would be no flavor. You would have the minimal nourishment, I'll put it that way, but there'd be no spice to it. There would be no seasoning to it. It would be you living forever off of Gerber's strained baby food or bananas. Don't get me in one of those arguments about, well, bananas are good, yeah. Not pablum. Refried oatmeal, how about that? White beans with even the white taken out. The individual, any individual, this would be one of the definitions, if you needed one of the descriptions of ordinary humanity, the middle of humanity, is that they individually get by on nothing but, more or less, literal thinking. And yet when I say that you can get by, the individual can get by, but his life, he could never describe this. He would never think to. His life would not be even as tolerable, it would not be as interesting as life is to the most mundane amongst humanity. Of some little person that just lives at home, maybe somebody who never, almost a recluse, somebody who just stays at home, maybe listen to the radio a little. I'm just saying somebody who seems to be almost a non-participant actively in life. They still are benefiting from metaphorical thought in life. It is what gives it the flavor. It's why you make a mistake if you do, saying you generically, to attack religion, any religion, to attack any myths, to attack fairy tales, to attack all the mythical, quote, insanity, irrationality of humanity. The only way it's worthy of attack is just between you and me talking. And then the only attack is to point out that that's not supposed to be taken literally. Religion, ideas of God, ideas of past lives, future lives, karma, reincarnation, anything mythical, anything that has even the flavor of myth, is not to be taken literally. That's the only worthy basis of any criticism, and I said that would only be between a couple of would-be mystics. They say, that's not supposed to be taken literally. So the point is, ordinary people individually can get by and never do anything, never actively, individually engage in anything much beyond literal thinking. But they do benefit. Life would not be what it is. And I don't mean this just poetically. I mean this technically, scientifically. Life itself, human life, would not be what it is now. And what it will be, were it not for a kind of collective, inspecific existence of metaphorical thinking, which is, as I said, what religion actually is. But notice the way it's practiced by ordinary individuals is, if they are, let's take religion again, if they are actively interested and actively participate in religions, they are taking it literally. That's one of those things that you can make a damn near unconditional statement. I mean, don't sit there and think, wait a minute, there could be people out taking religion seriously that don't take it literally. No. The only way you can take it, quote, seriously, is to take it literally. That is, limited view, but literal. But the thing is, even if those who are taking it literally and do not see beyond, do not individually see and sense anything beyond the literal interpretation they've been given or the one they accept of religion, they still benefit from the metaphorical, the mythical reality of religion. The same as those who claim to be atheists, non-participants. It is like an unseen part of the ether that gives flavor, that gives a kind of spice, that gives an interest. Again, let's say religion. Somebody claims they're an atheist. Many people on the planet do, always have. But you understand, even those who say, I've got no interest in religion, period. I don't fool with it, it's just blah, blah. They benefit from it. The myth of it, the allegory of it. But by the time it reaches ordinary people, it is now not anything specifically of interest to them, because all they do is think literally. It was those who were not thinking literally at some time made up, spoke each and every metaphorical sayings, picture, term that you ever heard. They were spoken by someone metaphorically to begin with. So you've got people living individually. I just want you to understand, I think, that operationally, functionally, pragmatically speaking, ordinary people survive solely. Solely means on literal thinking. It does not individually require that you do anything other than that. If you're going to ever scratch where you may unusually itch, if you are ever going to step anywhere close to that metaphorical, that metaphysical, or in express, you have to do something other than literal think. Literal think will not move you. You can run around in circles if you call that moving. You can argue. You can be a debater. You might be invited to appear on firing line sometime, or give an opposing view on your local editorial portion of a TV news show. Or if nothing else, write a letter to the editor, damn it. But it has nothing to do with understanding life. It has absolutely nothing to do. You're not even close. It's just nothing to discuss. If you cannot get beyond literal thinking, any idea that you will ever increase your consciousness is simply a dream. Metaphorical thought is, back to this, it takes what's going on already, does not change it, does not argue with it, does not debate it, does not respond to it, does not write letters to the editor. That is, it does not write versions of it and throw it down to itself sitting down there in the floor of the theater like a spitball hollering, "You're wrong," and try to hit in the head so it'll look. It takes what's going on and gives a whole new interpretation, which is why I described it as metaphorical thought would be thought that does not mean what it thinks. I know it gets sticky. All right, metaphorical speech, if that's what it was, hey, some dirty dog backed into my car. You don't mean a dog backed into your car. It's simply, you do not mean that. Or he has more lives than a cat. You do not mean that. So metaphorical thought means something other than it thinks. Which, when I say what it thinks, it does not think. In the ordinary sense, literal thinking is already thought. It's already thinking. You were born there, and there you think. There you sit, and there you will think for your appointed days. Metaphorical thinking is unnatural, it's unnecessary, damn near impossible to any continuing, constant degree. But if you can, then what you're thinking now metaphorically actually has no unique personal basis. It would not even exist. It could not exist were it not for down there literal thinking already taking place. So in a sense, metaphorical thinking is non-original. It could not exist were it not for literal thinking, because now metaphorical thinking takes that thinking and thinks something other than what it is. That means, when I make that look and do that finger, that means something. I don't know what. Well, of course, I know the main thing. Some people missed it. Now, before we get to symbolic, I want to tell you again, the whole thing about being able to drive all this up the nervous system, literal thinking starts, we could say, at the base of the brain. It starts at the old mammalian, the beginning of the mammalian territorially driven brain. But then as you begin to feel the energy surge up, and as you can do it more and more, and you can push it up like in the balcony here, but that's the metaphor of it, here in the brain, and you're able to push those energies, those juices up in the brain to where you know it's going to expand. The most important thing is being able to put your fingers there on the temples, see, and make those gestures. That's the most important thing. It's not fasting or dieting or sitting and meditating. It's being able to. Just wanted to remind you of that. Am I going to finally have to say, after having done that 3 times, the punchline would have had to do with something about predictability. I'm doing a part now. Metaphorical thinking would not exist without literal, and in a sense it is non-original. That's not true because it is original, but it does not come up with its own original thinking. It takes what's going on and thinks it, that is, it's already being thought, but then thinks something other than what that thinking is. That is the adjustment. That is the ability. There's no way to describe this, so I'll go ahead. That's the ability of what is normally going through ordinary humanity at the intellectual level. Read through you. Through your literal thinking, that part of your brain, that part of your mind, according to how fast you are, that is sitting down there that you'll never change. It is going to think what it thinks forever. What humanity is thinking, what the collective is thinking, is flashing through that screen, and there it sits. It may agree with some scenes, it may stick out its tongue, it may try to throw milk duds at the screen, It may get milk duds thrown at it. It may argue, but it sits there, and what is going on is all it can think about. Whether it be pro or con, it is going to think that, and you're not ever going to change it. Only intellectually sophisticated people can do that. I know that because they say they can. Again, you must bow in the face of superior knowledge. Well, in the face of your superiors. Metaphorical thinking, in that sense, is not original. Again, I got to do it is original, but it is not working on an original basis. It takes what's going on and what's being thought. It thinks something other than what's being thought, but about what's being thought. You understand? Sure you do. Okay. Symbolic thinking. Symbolic thinking like encompasses the inside of the whole theater. It's like the symbolic thinking is now a step removed, a step beyond metaphorical thinking. Symbolic thinking is now, we're getting close to original. So close I'm tempted to say it, but I won't. It's only my finger stands between you and I, and me saying that, but I will not. No. That's one thing that's good for. No. Tut tut. Symbolic thinking, now, what it thinks means what it thinks, which several times I've done it about, do you like the one tonight? I knew you would. Okay, we don't have to cover that one then. The guy stepped out from the crowd and announced, the first man who stepped away from the crowd, stood away and looked back at him and says, we are what we are. Only to be followed by another man who stepped down and he went, nay, we are what's happened to us. Or we are what we've done. But then a third man stepped out and says, no. We are what we think. And there was a pause for a considerable length of time. Considerable. You remember I did that? Considerable. All right, just between you and I, that could be, would you believe, hundreds of years, thousands? Considerable length of time. How about thousands? I'm just guessing. Well, I mean, I just read the story too, like you. I'm guessing. And then a considerable length of time. And then another guy stepped from the crowd. And he says, we are what we are. Or we are born what we are. And then I presented the question, or at least the news item said, my question now is, how many in the crowd, which the crowd is humanity, how many in the crowd do you think realized, after all this time, which I'm suggesting you could have been thousands of years, that the fourth guy, the last guy's comment, simply took him right back because it was just a quote of the first guy. Do you like that? Not particularly. Adam stepped out from the crowd. Could have been Adam's son. He stepped down and he says, we are what we're born. And then, to take this story and to really hack it up, then last night, after this considerable length of time, you got to admit, between Adam and last night, a guy stepped out from the crowd again and went, we are what we're born. Well, I told you wouldn't like it, but that could be, you could say the crowd is born there, you are there. Symbolic thinking is getting so close, remember, that only this stands between me going ahead and saying symbolic thinking is original. It is so close that next time we may even get into it. Symbolic thinking is now thinking what it thinks, that is what it thinks is what it thinks. All right, back to speech. What it says, it means what it says literally, but it means something else. In a sense that actually defies, although it will sound all right, it will sound flyable, I can say symbolic thinking, if it means what it says to itself and something else, you could say, well, follow this, that all this is a combination of literal thinking, which means what it says, right? And metaphorical thinking, which means something other than it says, right? Yeah. So symbolic thinking, you could think, if you were taking allegories as being spatially coherent, dream on. But it fits. It makes sense. Listen to this. I'll end it on it being rational and fitting. Then you could say, well, wait a minute. Then symbolic thinking is simply a combination of that by my own definition, my own description. Literal thinking means what it thinks. Metaphorical thinking means something other than what it thinks. But then symbolic thinking is two things. It means what it thinks and something else. And so you say, well, it is a combination of those two. It sounds right, but it's not. Because what it now thinks, in the sense that would sound comparable to the literal, that I say symbolic thinking has two aspects, that it means what it thinks and it means something else. Then you say, all right, the first part is comparable to literal thinking. Yeah, except now when I say symbolic thinking means what it thinks, we're not even talking about down the floor of the theater anymore. It's still there, but we're no longer, if you get into that area, we're no longer concerned with tracking, adjusting, fooling with literal thinking. Which some of you who, I know it always gets some reaction when I do one of these about a guy looks around at entertainment and goes, you call that entertainment? But for those of you that sometimes go, ha! Remember this, for your benefit and yours alone tonight, I gave you a new definition of sarcasm. Ha! It's humor, with what little humor there is in humor, removed. It's not funny. Oh, we're out of time. And let that be a lesson to you.